Hello, my name is Pastor Matt White, and I am going to teach a geographical summary of the Old Testament. Basically what that means is what I want to do over the next 30 minutes or so. I want to give you a very good panoramic overview of all the history and major events and people of the Old Testament. This is very significant because many of us, we look at our Old Testament, we start plowing through it in January or February, having our New Year's resolution, and it's a good resolution to have, but we get bogged down somewhere in Exodus or Leviticus, and we never really get through it all, or we have that we want to read in the Old Testament, or we avoid it altogether, which is a tremendous setback to the understanding of the Bible as a whole. We know that all Scripture is inspired of God and profitable for doctrine, reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. That includes Genesis all the way through Revelation. It's the whole Testament. As New Testament believers, we have a priority and we have a privilege to go into the Old Testament, because the New Testament is the foundational truths come out of the truth of the Old Testament. As you may have heard it said, the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And for some of these tremendous foundational truths, themes of the Old Testament, such as sacrifice and covenant and redemption, and these carry significant truths and realities for us as believers, and we lose so much of the power of the New Testament if we do not have a good, solid underpinning and understanding of the history and people of the Old Testament. I mean, in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, the Apostle Paul said, for whatever things were written down, they were written for our learning, so that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And so that includes the testament of the Old Testament Scriptures. He also goes to say to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 10:6, now these things became our examples. And he's referring to the people, events, and stories of the Old Testament. So we do have a responsibility to do our due diligence in the Old Testament. And I believe one of the best ways to get a good understanding of the Old Testament is to step back and to get a panoramic, very high up view of the Old Testament, to get to see the big picture before we start drilling down into books of the Bible or into chapters or into verses or into individual words. We first need to see the big picture. We need to see the story of the Old Testament in context. The Old Testament is made up of 39 individual books, but yet those 39 books have one purpose. They each provide a significant part to the overall story of the Bible, and we need to know the history of the Old Testament. I am so thankful that the Bible didn't just drop out of the sky and talk about people and places and things that we have no context to. Then it would just be a science fiction. It would just be a fairy tale. But one of the beauties of the Old Testament and also the New Testament is that the Christian faith is grounded and rooted in historical realities. We can go over to these lands and many of these towns and cities to this day through excavation. Some are still going on at this moment, and we have proved the reliability and truthfulness of the facts and information of the Bible over and over and over. We have a faith that is grounded firmly upon the truth and foundation and the historical reality of God, of the Bible, and the people and the places and the events that are in them. So that gives me great confidence. It takes my faith to that next level. It's not a blind faith. It's grounded and rooted in historical truth and reality. And so what you're staring at right now is a map. It's a geographical summary of the Old Testament. If you get your bearings here, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. You're going to need to have this map to be able to maximize so that you can fill this in as I'm going through it. If you go to www.elitx.org, go there, and I'm going to have a PDF file of this where you can download it, print it out. If you haven't done it yet, pause this, go out there, print it out for yourself, and as I'm sharing this, you can fill this map out yourself. And I promise you, if you follow with me and you pause when you have to fill in the notes that I put up and do some things, and then I believe you're going to have a a much better understanding, and it'll boost your confidence in the flow of the Old Testament and how these books of the Bible fit together. But I want to give you some geography here. We're going to put some landmarks on this map, and so I'm going to come over here. The first one is Egypt. Now you can't see Egypt because I'm in the way, so I'm going to put the screen down here briefly so you can see this. I think I am. All right, I'm having trouble here. There we go. There is Egypt right there. Go ahead and write that on your map. I'm going to continue on. I'm going to pop back up here, but I'm going to. Then you have the Mediterranean Sea. Notice how this big body of water right here will be the Mediterranean Sea, or is the Mediterranean Sea. But all this space is also going to be for notes. So just put it down right down here. If you will fill things out in the general areas and sizes that I have, it'll make sure, because when we're done, this is going to be like a chalkboard inside a football coach's office. It's going to be all marked up, and it's going to, and if you know what you're looking at, it's going to make a lot of sense. So just make things nice and neat, and I think you'll be feel better about it when it's done. So this is the Mediterranean Sea. Again, I'm going to be always moving quickly. I'm going to push through this, pause, get caught up, and then hit play. After the Mediterranean Sea over here, we have down here we have the Red Sea. After the Red Sea, this is the land of Canaan, which is a very significant, obviously, part of the Old Testament history. Canaan eventually becomes the Promised Land and becomes where most of the Old Testament takes place. There's some bodies of water that are significant. We have the Sea of Galilee right here. We have this river that connects these two large bodies of water. This river, if you're familiar, is the Jordan River, that is very significant in Old Testament history as well as New Testament history. You know, this is the river that Jesus was baptized by John in. Then it flows into the Dead Sea right here. After the Dead Sea, I want to come over here. There's another river, major river in history of the Old Testament. This is the Euphrates. If you really already know a lot of history, you know that our geography, that there's another river missing. I didn't put this in. It's the Tigris. The Tigris would run right along here. But for now, just know that we have the Euphrates River. And this Euphrates River, to the right of it in this area, right, Assyria. This is going to be a major player later on towards the end of Old Testament history. And then Babylon, again, this country, this area will also play a significant part towards the very end of the Old Testament history. And then, of course, the Euphrates River flows into the Persian Gulf. And over here, if you saw, I just a bunch of numbers 1 through 11 popped up here. I'm going to start talking about these different numbers. This Old Testament map, or I should say this map of the Old Testament history and area has numbers 1, 1b, 2, 3. And this is going to be like connecting the dots. But rather than having a physical picture that will turn into something, what we'll have is we're going to see the movement and migration of the significant people and the Hebrew children, the Israelites, when they come together and become a country of their own, or a people group of their own. We're going to see where all this fits, and so I believe you're going to really enjoy this, and you're going to get a deep appreciation of the flow of the Old Testament, the history through it, and you'll be able to understand a significant part of where all these books of the Bible connect to one another, and not just see them as 39 different books and wondering where they fit in the overall picture. The first city we're going to kick off over here is found in the land of Ur. I want you to write that down right there. Ur, and then up here we have Haran. We have a 1A and a 1B, because what happens here is you're going to see a little line. So if you have your markers or you have your pens or pencils, I want you just to go ahead and kind of draw a line that kind of waves up the Euphrates River and ends up at Haran. This begins in Genesis chapter 12. This history of the Old Testament is going to start right there in Genesis chapter 12. We're going to start with Abraham. It's interesting when you look into the history or the timetable of the Old Testament. The Bible as a whole, from Genesis to Revelation, actually covers around 4,100 years. Of that 4,100 years, only 100 years is in the New Testament. From the birth of Jesus to when the Apostle Paul or John the Revelator writes some of the last books in the in the New Testament, that covers about 100 years. But the Old Testament covers 4,000 years, starting with the beginning of creation, and from Genesis 1 to Genesis chapter 1 to Genesis chapter 11, that covers roughly 2,000 years of the 4,100 years in the Bible history. And let's say, I'm just going to leave off the New Testament right now. For the 4,000 years over the Old Testament, 2,000 of that is in Genesis chapter 1 to 11. Out of that, from Genesis 12 to Genesis chapter 50, we have about 300 years of history. And so the majority of Old Testament history, if you're going to include Genesis 1 through 11, and you do, it's part of the Bible, that covers almost 2,300 years. And then Abraham comes on the scene in Genesis towards the end of chapter 11 in verse 12, and it says that God told him to take his family and to go to the land that God was going to call him to. He made a great promise. And it says that Abraham collected his things on the early part of his journey. He didn't just, he also took his father. And it says that he traveled from Ur, and he traveled up, and this is a major highway, and this follows the Euphrates River. And at one point, he took a little right-hand turn, or went north, and he ended up in Haran. Haran is that's a 600-mile journey that he took on camels and walking and getting his family there. When he got to Haran, it says that his father died. And it was from there, after his father died, that he took and went on down into Canaan. But this is where we get, the majority of Genesis starts right here. And so I write, I'm going to put books of the Bible where this kind of history takes place. And Genesis right here, because that's where it starts. And then I put these notes up here. And it says, Abraham, Sarah, and Terah leave Ur to go to Canaan. And I say via. It's actually via, he just goes up there. That's actually, I should take that off. Then I say 1b. Up here at 1b, Abraham's father dies, and then Abraham leaves for Canaan. So what we have here is, after a while, they stay here for a little bit, and then they start heading down, and eventually Abraham ends up in the land of Canaan. That's a wonderful story. This is also continues in the book of Genesis. This journey is roughly 400 miles down into the arid land of Canaan. And so it's kind of significant when you get to see your bearings even already, that when God told Abraham to get up and go, and then a couple verses later he's there. What you may not realize if you don't have a map, and if you're going to really study the Old Testament, you need a map. You need to be able to put things in context and see how things are working. That was a 1,000-mile journey. This was no small, grab up your things and we're going to be gone a couple weeks. And no, this was a significant, a 1,000-mile road trip is long when you're in a car. But let alone if you're walking and riding camels and packing your belongings on donkeys and having to provide for all the people. It was very significant thing that Abraham did, and that's why Abraham did, and that's why he is recognized. One of the reasons he's recognized as a man of faith, the father of our faith, this was no significant move for him. And so he eventually came down here into the land of Canaan. And what happens next? So I have Genesis here, continues Genesis. This is all part of Genesis. Him working down, he comes in, and eventually what happens is we know that, just backdrop about Abraham. Abraham was 75 years old when he entered Canaan. So eventually when he got into here, he was 75 years old. And when he got to Canaan, God promised him, he said, I'm going to give you a son. You're going to become the father of many nations. And Abraham, by this time, was 75 years old. Sarah was about 10 years younger, so Sarah's around 60. And even when they lived a little bit longer at this time, this was beyond the age of normal childbirth. Sarah was beyond the age. But God gave Abraham a promise that he would be the father of many nations, that he would give his wife Sarah a son. Well, it took about 15 years into it, and Abraham still did not have a son. And one of the points that, Sarah, if you know the story well, gives Abraham her maidservant Hagar and says, "Okay, we're gonna get a baby our own way," rather than at this point in time trusting God and His word. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham. Abraham's technically his first son born to him was not Isaac; it was Ishmael. Ishmael was born as a result of unbelief, as a result of doubting the promise, as a result of trying to do it man's way. And that's a tremendous story there in and of itself. But finally, he waits and waits and waits. Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. That's not the son of promise. But eventually, God appears to Abraham and Sarah and says, "Now's the time. A year from now, this time next year, you're going to have a boy." Sarah laughs because she realizes by now she's like 89, 90 years old. She's, her years or days of childbearing have long since gone. And sure enough, Sarah becomes pregnant at 90 years old. That is a miracle. If you were to see that on the front line of the National Enquirer, 90-year-old woman gives birth to baby, and you know what? You probably have. Why? Because National Enquirer, it's lies. It's, sensationalism. It's impossible for a 90-year-old woman to give birth. I think maybe it's happened for women at age 50, and some of these rare instances maybe pushing in their 60s. But eventually the womb dries up, and the eggs of the female become no longer viable, and they are unable from that point on to conceive. But God supernaturally, miraculously opens Sarah's womb, and she gives birth to Isaac. Isaac is the son of promise. Fascinating story, because this is important. Isaac, in many ways, represents Jesus. Isaac was supernaturally conceived by his mother, who was well past the age of childbearing. Jesus was supernaturally conceived by the Holy Spirit from the Virgin Mary. But I would love to go into more of the comparisons there, but just simply know that eventually Abraham moves down into the land of Canaan. He settles in there. He has a son by the promise, Isaac. This is some of the notes here. He has Isaac and Ishmael, and then Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. And during this time period, then Jacob has 12 sons and one daughter, and then one of Jacob's sons by the name of Joseph. We're not out of Genesis yet. Joseph is born, and if you know the story well, Joseph was one of Jacob's favorites, and his brothers hated him for it. And then God began to give Joseph dreams, and he began to tell his dreams to his brothers. One more reason to hate him, and finally they decided to kill him. And God supernaturally intervened. Rather than killing him, they sold him to a caravan of Egyptians, or a caravan of people going down into Egypt. And then they told their father that Joseph had been killed, and they dipped his favorite coat that he had given his son in blood, and just made the father infer or think that his son had died. But we know the story. If you know the story, the fascinating thing about Joseph is, I think there's like 12 or 13 chapters of the Old Testament is devoted to the story of Joseph. Again, he is also a type of Christ, and signifies in many ways the life of Jesus. But Joseph is sold into slavery, and he is taken down into Egypt. And if you know the story, it was for such a time, the great famine hit all over this area. But Joseph had given, God had given Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. And eventually we know that he gets falsely accused, he gets put in prison, but then he predicts some dreams, and eventually the Pharaoh has a dream. He gets sent before Pharaoh. He is able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams through the help of God when no one else was able to. And the purpose of the dream was there was going to be 7 years of abundance, and then there was going to be a 7-year severe drought. and now is the time. And so eventually that's exactly what happened. Pharaoh rewarded Joseph by putting him second in charge, and over the next 7 years he managed making sure that the Egyptians stockpiled grain and resources in preparation for the famine. And just as Joseph had predicted, just as God had shown Pharaoh in a dream, the famine hit. And somewhere in that famine we have Jacob and his sons still up in Canaan area. But Jacob, who, if you know, actually God eventually changes his name to Israel. I'm going to start calling him Israel from now on, but Jacob and Israel are the same person. Israel sends his sons down into Egypt to buy grain. And they don't know that eventually they meet up with Joseph. At the time, they didn't know it was Joseph. And they eventually, it gets found out. Joseph says, God has placed me here, bring the family down. So towards the very end of Genesis, we have 70 people, 70 Israel and his sons and daughters and wives and grandchildren. There were 70 of them. They are brought down into Egypt, and they are the Pharaoh welcomes them because they are family to Joseph, and God provides for that family. And we end up at the end of Genesis with Joseph dying. But now that his family has settled there in Egypt and called it land of Goshen. And it was a wonderful opportunity. But when we move into Exodus, and that's what happens next, they're there for about 400 years. And if you know the Bible story well, we know that starting in Exodus, that eventually the Israelites grew, the Hebrew children grew, the family of Joseph, they began to grow, and roughly 300 or 400 years later, they're no longer 70 people, but they're estimated from 500,000 to perhaps 1 million Hebrews that have now populated and grown and thrived. Eventually, somewhere in all this, we know the Egyptians decided, we need to deal shrewdly with them, one version says. In other words, they made them slaves because they were afraid that eventually they're going to populate, perhaps overthrow or do something. So when we move into Exodus, we see that now they are not just coexisting with the Egyptians, they now have been put into slavery. And God hears their cries, he hears their pain and misery, and he raises up Moses. We move into Exodus. Exodus begins the story of the birth of Moses. And sure enough, right there we have Exodus. Put Exodus down right there. And after 400 years, Moses leads the Israelites out. The story of Exodus is a story of the redemption. God supernaturally brings the Israelite children out of Egypt, and he brings them across the crossing of the Red Sea, supernaturally divides the waters, brings them down. We know that's just so much story. I hate to go so fast over this, but if I don't, I won't get through this in time. He brings them down to Mount Sinai. This is where in Exodus 19 and in Exodus 24 that God descends upon the mountain, and here's where the giving of the law, here's where the 10 Commandments come into play. And God gives them a covenant. He says, follow these 10 Commandments. If you want to be holy, this is what you got to do. And so the law is delivered. At the top of the mountaintop, God gives Moses the 10 Commandments, but not just the 10. He also gives them lots of policies and rules and other laws. He also gives him the diagram or the architecture, how to build the tabernacle. So Exodus is about that. And so that takes place, and eventually God's wanting to take them into the promised land. So number 4, it says, here it says, Moses received the law at Mount Sinai. This is in Exodus and also in Leviticus. What happens next is they're coming right up, and they get right to the southern end of Canaan, remember, this is the land that Abraham came into, and God said it's going to be yours, you and your descendants. They get to the very southern end. It's about ready to move in. And if you know, oh my goodness. Then they send 12 spies in to kind of check it out, to see what it's going to be like, and the spies come back. 10 spies say, they're too big, they're too ugly, they're too smelly, they're too strong, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. And they bring back a message of doubt and unbelief. And the 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, say, we can do this. They trusted God because God told them so, but the Israelites believed the witness of the 10 spies that said we can't. It upset God. He said in unbelief. So what happened here is this is what we call the wanderings. God said it's not time. You're not ready. There's too much doubt and unbelief. So what's going to happen now? The wilderness wanderings. This is in the book of Numbers. This is all about the time when God said, nope, you're not going to go. And he said, you're going to wander in the wilderness until everyone basically ages 20 and up dies off. And I'm going to raise up a new generation that's going to trust me. And the only two that did not die off in this before they entered the promised land was Joshua and Caleb, because they had heard and obeyed and stood on faith to the witness of God. And so God allowed them. So this is the book of Numbers. Again, this is 12 spies sent to Canaan, but because of unbelief, so they wandered. The book of Numbers is a book of wanderings in the wilderness, where God supernaturally provides them with water from a rock. He provides them manna and to eat, and he just always is protecting them, always guiding them through this. Eventually, 40 years goes by. He moves them up, and eventually they head north. They get to the edge, looking over into the promised land. God says, God doesn't allow Moses. Moses dies. Aaron dies. And now the command goes to Joshua. Joshua was second in command to Moses. He was Moses' understudy, his personal assistant. And so now it's the time of Joshua. And this is just before Moses dies, he writes the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy doesn't have as much history as it is a second telling of the law. It's like a magnum opus for Moses. It's beautiful. Moses reiterates the law, and he reiterates things, and he pulls it all in. So Deuteronomy is one of the best books of the Old Testament in terms of just how beautifully it's written, and it was referring to you will be blessed if you do this, you will be cursed if you do that, and it kind of puts it all in a nutshell for him. But now it's time to, again, second covenant, Deuteronomy, is before they cross the Jordan. Right now, now we move into the book of Joshua. God supernaturally parts the Jordan River, allows Joshua and the Israelites to cross over the river. They're going to go in, they're going to conquer now. And so what we have here is in the book of Joshua and Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It all happens right here. All in this area. Joshua is a story of the conquests of Joshua and the Israelites. They come in and they take over the land of Canaan, killing the people and taking over the cities and conquering the land that God had promised to them. But it's also a sad story because they didn't follow God fully, and so they left some people alive, and they married some of the women foreign women that at this time they were not supposed to marry, and so they intermingled in the false religions, and the intermingling and not doing all that God had said got them in trouble. And isn't that so true? When we do not follow God completely, it allows the entanglements of sin to bring us down. And so the book of Judges is a story. It takes place 300 or 400 years, where it's kind of a dark time. It's Judges is a time where they serve God, and then they start to fall off and not serve God, and then they get into idolatry, and then God sends somebody to an enemy to come in and oppress them, and then they cry out to God, and God raises up a judge, and there's Othniel and Shamgar and Deborah and Samson and Gideon. These are just a kind of list of some of the judges during this time that God would raise up. And there's a 300 or 400 years where this takes place. But eventually, bring a kingdom comes together. Saul is anointed the first king of Israel. He has a son. Oh no, not Saul. Saul very early shows that he's not fit to be king. So God raises up and anoints David. Eventually, David ascends to the throne, and he begins to unite the kingdom together. David has a son named Solomon. Under Solomon's reign, it was the empire, it was the strength, it was the most. Solomon was known for his wisdom, and the country of Israel was also known for their riches. It was the high point in the kingdom history of the Israelites, but it doesn't end there, unfortunately. They begin to fall. Eventually, the kingdom divides, or civil war. So the splits, and then there's Israel is split in half. And to the north, they keep and hold the name Israel. To the south, they call themselves Judah. And then there is a period of where there's a king, the books of 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles is you're going back and forth between the king of the northern country of Israel and the king of the southern country of Judah, and all the different things that happen there. And what happens here is the United Kingdom lasts 120 years. King Saul reigned about 40 years. King David reigned 40 years. And then King Solomon reigned 40 years. And then the divided kingdom. The divided kingdom happens in roughly 931 BC. And what happens next? I forgot. We're getting ahead of myself. Here's some notes. If you want to write those out for number 7, you can. I'm going to move on. Just pause me if you haven't filled that out. And what happens now, eventually the northern kingdom falls in 931 BC. The country of Assyria, here I'm pointing, use my computer pointer. Assyria comes down and they conquer Israel, and they take a bunch of people out. If you remember, Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. If you know your Bible history, Jonah and the whale. Well, God told Jonah, go to Nineveh and preach repentance. And Jonah didn't want to do that because the Assyrians were ruthless. They were mean, and they had taken a bunch of people out. And when they conquered the northern country of Israel, they took a bunch of people out, and they never returned. And so that took place there. This is really in the book of 2nd Kings. This is where the northern tribes are taken captivity. Remember, I didn't say this. When the country was split, there were 10 tribes that were a part of the northern country in Judah and Benjamin. I could be mistaken there on the two tribes to the southern. But all you know is Israel was to the north, Judah was to the south. But the northern country is taken into captivity by Assyria. They start to come down to conquer Judah, but at that time King Hezekiah was king of Judah. Hezekiah cries out to God, and God saves them. Assyria decides they got other fish to fry. They're going to come back later. That never happens. Eventually, what happens is roughly about 150 years later, Assyria is toppled by Babylon, by the Babylonians. And so what the Assyrians didn't do and couldn't do, the Babylonians do. The Babylonians the Assyria came down in, I believe, 722 BC and took the northern country in 586. About 150 years later, the Babylonians came in and they conquered Judah. The capital of Judah was Jerusalem. So they leveled Jerusalem. They destroyed the walls. They destroyed the temple. They took everything of value, and they took, there were 3 different times where they just took people, the best of the best, and they took them captive back into Babylon. If this is a time where you have Daniel and Ezekiel, these were prophets that were part of the Babylonian invasion, and they were taken over into Babylon. And God had made a promise, and he said, 70 years of captivity, and after 70 years, you're going to be able to go back. And sure enough, this is the southern tribes route. Sure enough, after 70 years, that began to happen, and there we have the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra is the story of the Israelites beginning to come back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed. The book of Nehemiah is a story of them going back and to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. And then at this time, we actually come to an end of Old Testament history. The people of God are back in the land, and they have no king. Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, is the last prophet that began to speak. But all the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and all the others that are in there that I haven't said, these were prophets that spoke into either the northern kingdom or to the southern kingdom when they were getting ready to be conquered or after they were conquered. And so all the rest of the Old Testament is, at least the prophets, are writings of men talking about that. But the history ends. Once we get to Nehemiah, then it's roughly 400 years later, and then we have Jesus coming in on the scene. And so what you have right now is you have a geographical summary of the Old Testament. And I hope this is an excellent opportunity for you as you go back through this, begin to chart your way through the Old Testament and through this history, and you're going to get a very solid foundation so you can get a visual view of all the history that takes place in the Old Testament. And I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I look forward to going to a next lesson, and we will begin to do that. So again, it is my pleasure. I thank God for the opportunity to be able to share this with you all, and go in God's blessings. Thank you.